This is the Mindset Game podcast, and I'm your host, James Roberts. And on today's show, I've got James Krieger. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
It's Krieger.
Krieger, sorry. So welcome onto the show, James.
Thanks for having me.
So can you give a brief introduction to who you are and what you do for the listeners that don't know about you?
Yeah, so I run a website called weightology.net where I coach clients on fat loss and weight loss and muscle gain, and I also write articles. I have a research review where I cover all the latest research in the fitness and exercise industry. I'm also a scientist myself. I actually have been publishing work alongside people like Brad Schoenfeld and others, work related to nutrition and building muscle and things like that. I've got 2 master's degrees, one in exercise science and then the other one in nutrition. Been involved in the fitness industry really since the 90s. I knew Lyle McDonald back in the 90s, so I've been pretty well connected to a lot of the people in the industry for quite a long time. And, I'm the former research director for a corporate weight management program. We mainly treated Microsoft employees, and our average weight loss was about 40 pounds in 3 months. So it was a really highly successful program. And so, yeah, that's just kind of a brief rundown of the stuff that I do.
So James, talk to me about hypertrophy in a little bit, because you did a study on pre versus post-exercise protein intake has a similar effect on muscular adaptation. So can you talk a little bit about that study?
Yeah, so I collaborated on that study with Brad Schoenfeld, now in Aragon, and the idea behind that study was, well, really what stimulated the idea for that study in the first place was that we published a big meta-analysis. And what a meta-analysis is where you take a bunch of studies and you put them all together and you kind of try to see what the trend is among a body of studies. And so we did this meta-analysis on protein intake and timing of protein intake and hypertrophy. And the idea, what we were looking for was, because everyone has this idea of this anabolic window that, like, if you want to maximize your muscle gains, you got to get some protein in, within 30 minutes or to an hour after your training session. Otherwise, you may not get the best gains. And our meta-analysis challenged that idea because what we found is that really the best predictor of gains was just total protein intake and not necessarily the timing of the intake. But one of the limitations we saw was there were very few studies that really directly addressed timing. Most of the studies out there, they would provide, like protein or carbohydrate after a training session, but that's not really, you're not testing timing, you're testing additional protein versus carbohydrate. If you want to test timing, you have to have, in one group provide protein, let's say after the workout, and then another group provide protein, before the workout or, later on in the day or at some different time point. And so that's what kind of stimulated the idea to do that study, that protein timing study that we did. And so we took men, put them on a resistance training program. One group had protein before the workout, another group had protein after the workout. And what we found is that there were really no differences in their gains over the time of the training program. Now, there were limitations to our study, and one of them was our subjects we found that were a little bit of an energy deficit. We had actually instructed them to eat a fair amount of food, but they were actually not eating enough even to maintain their body weight. And so these subjects were in a slight energy deficit, which may have impacted the results. But what we could say from that study is, at least if you're in an energy deficit, if you're consuming protein before your workout or after your workout, it's not really going to make any difference to your gains. Another limitation of our study was the sample size. And really, that's a limitation of a lot of exercise studies. Is you just, it's hard to get enough people to, it'd be nice if we had 100 people per group, but that just doesn't happen. So that's what we did in that study, and certainly challenged the idea of timing. And I think Brad's got another study in the works, another timing study in the works. And this time, we want to make sure the subjects are not, in an energy deficit this time. So.
And James, can you explain to the listeners why there is that myth of obviously taking protein after training?
Yeah, yes. So the idea is what we do know is that when you do a weight training session, you stimulate what's called protein synthesis. You basically stimulate your muscles to build new protein. And a lot of people don't realize that process starts immediately after your training session. I mean, your muscles are already working to build new muscle tissue, right after the training session. A lot of people, because there's some people that argue that, oh, you have to recover first before you build muscle, and it takes, 24, 48 hours before your body starts to build muscle. And that's not true. Your body's building muscle actually right away after the training session. So the idea is some people think that, well, geez, if I get this elevation in protein synthesis right after a training session, I better have some protein around if I want to maximize my gains. But it's kind of a myth that it needs to be done right away because there's a couple reasons why. Number one, unless you're training in a fasted state, most of us are not training fasted. We're either eating at some point before our training session or some point, within a few hours after our training session. And so we already have some protein in our body because it takes time to digest protein and everything. And so most of us are training within an anabolic window anyway. If you ate something 1 hour, 2 hours before your training session, you've already got some protein in your body, so you don't need to suddenly rush home and chug a protein shake right afterwards, and so you're always kind of, again, unless you're training fasted, which is a different story, you're always going to be in a little bit of an anabolic window, as long as you're eating a regular meal pattern. The other thing is that protein synthesis, it's not like it goes up for an hour and then it's gone. It's actually elevated for, approximately 24 to 48 hours after a training session. Now, the biggest elevation happens probably in the 4 hours after a training session, but most people will eat within 4 hours of a training session. Most people aren't just going to go to the gym and then not have anything for 4 hours. So you've got plenty of time to ingest protein. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this, 30-minute to 60-minute window after a training session.
So that notion that it's kind of that go-to of having a protein shake, obviously after that 30 minutes, you could look to probably having a proper meal in all reality then.
Yeah, you could just have a proper meal and you'd be fine. You don't necessarily need to have the protein shake or whatever. Now, you could have the protein, if you're a person you're like, you know what, I just want to make absolutely 100% sure I'm going to have my protein shake, and that's fine. It's certainly not going to hurt you. So if people want to do that, then that's fine. But you don't have to think that it's if you somehow miss a protein shake after a training session, but you're still getting a meal in within a reasonable amount of time, then it's not something you need to worry about. So.
Okay, that's quite interesting. And then in another study you raised, you looked at longer interset rest periods, enhanced muscle strength and hypertrophy.
Yeah.
What I found interesting to that study was obviously longer rest is normally associated with strength training anyway. Why did you find from the results that you can associate it to hypertrophy as well?
So I think one of the reasons you typically see the longer rests are better is just because you get higher load volumes when, if you're doing multiple sets of an exercise, if I'm doing, say, 3 or 4 sets of an exercise, if I take longer rest period, I can use more weight on each set versus if I'm taking short rest periods, well, I got to keep dropping the weight each set. And so over a span of 3 or 4 sets, I just get higher load volume, and we know there's a relationship between load volume and hypertrophy. So the idea is basically you're able to create more muscle tension over a longer period of time, and so that's why you get a better hypertrophy stimulus with the longer rest training. So now there may be some caveats to that. There's some evidence possibly that for some of the small upper body muscle groups, there may be some benefits to doing, really short rest training, but that evidence is kind of preliminary. But for the most part, I would say, most of your training session should have reasonably long rest periods, probably 2 minutes or more. usually. So
And is it more so? How would I bring that question up? That it's a case because obviously it's not a myth. Obviously, with the 60-second rest is generally associated with hypertrophy, but for the ones that struggle with timekeeping, would they it's obviously you say that you're going to get better gains from taking that longer rest. Is it kind of being not keen to jump straight back into the exercise and letting obviously your body recover in that space of time? So obviously looking at obviously increasing your ATP levels back up so you can perform the exercise. Well, letting the muscle perform at its best.
yeah, so because when you take a longer, the problem is when you take short rest periods, what happens is, you get a depletion of phosphocreatine, and so you're not allowing enough time for replenishment of phosphocreatine levels. You also get a bigger buildup of acidic conditions in the muscle, which can actually impair muscle contraction and contribute to fatigue. So you're not able to use as much weight on subsequent sets, and so your overall load volume is impaired. And there was even a study that looked at protein synthesis and rest intervals, and saw a similar thing, that when people did shorter rest intervals, not only was there a lower load volume, but there was also the magnitude of the protein synthesis response was not as big either. So it definitely kind of goes against the idea, because it was believed for a long time that if you really wanted to train for hypertrophy, you should do short rest training, mainly because it would give you a big pump and stuff. But a lot of the data indicates that for at least most of your training, it's preferable to do longer rest. It doesn't mean you need to rest 5 minutes between sets, but and it's going to be varied by the exercise. Obviously, an exercise like a squat or a deadlift, you want to take more rest than an exercise like a barbell curl or something like that. A smaller muscle group is going to recover its force production much faster than a big heavy compound movement. So.
And then the last one we go to is the single versus multiple sets of resistance exercise for muscle hypertrophy. Obviously, you obviously with one set reps, it's generally a case of looking more at strength and power. And you were saying that obviously there's going to be a difference between doing one set as opposed to doing 2 to 3. What surprised me was there was no difference between doing 2 to 3 to 4 or more. And why do you think that was the case?
If you're referring to my 2010 paper, one of the reasons we didn't see a difference, really, there was actually a difference in terms of the magnitude of the change, but it just wasn't statistically significant. And so the biggest reason I think there wasn't a difference was because I didn't have enough studies at the time that did 4 to 6 sets per exercise. There was only like 2 studies, and so I didn't have what we call statistical power. I didn't have enough statistical power to actually say that there was a difference, even though it looked like there was. So, Brad and I, we did kind of an updated version of that analysis recently, but we looked at it in terms of weekly volume, and we found that, the best hypertrophy gains were observed with a weekly volume of at least 10 sets or more. So, how you split that up, it could be 5 sets twice per week, 3 to 4 sets 3 times per week, something like that. But it was really a weekly volume of 10 sets per more that we found the best gains in muscle size. So, and that was, again, that was a meta-analysis.
And then, James, if you didn't have the how would you put it, time constraints to be able to get in, say, 10 sets a week, would say doing something like drop sets be more beneficial to that person?
Yeah, I think so. I actually think there's some data out there suggest that drop sets might be beneficial for people. If you're lacking time, if you're training with a low volume, I'd say the past 2 or 3 months I have been experimenting with drop sets. with relaunching my site and getting my coaching business and everything else going, I it was really hard for me to get into the gym, and so I was only going to the gym twice per week, and I was just doing 2 whole body workouts per week. And at the time, I thought, well, I'm just going to try to maintain, but I was familiar with some data on drop sets, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a lot of drop sets for my isolation movements, maybe just like 1 drop set per muscle group, and so I started doing that, and I would do 1 set of 11, 12, 13 reps to failure, and then do 3 20% drops, so dropping the weight 20%, repping out as much as I could, dropping the weight 20%, repping out, and then finally one last 20% drop and then repping out. And typically I might get 4 to 6 reps with each drop, so I did that, and what I was amazed at is that I actually set a bunch of PRs and a bunch of isolation movements doing that just twice per week. It was kind of amazing to me. So I would say, for people that, if you're lacking time and stuff, that can be a really time efficient way to get a little bit more volume in. I prefer doing them. I think they're the most beneficial for isolation movements, because if you're going to do a bunch of drop sets with compound movements, it's just too exhausting, and that's why I stuck with isolation movements for my drop set work. But yeah, I think it can be a nice way for people that have a limited amount of time to train. It can be a certain alternative to really get an effective training session in and actually stimulate some gains. Like I said, I was kind of surprised with some of the improvements I had. I'll just give one example. I was doing there's one lateral raise machine that I really like in my gym. It's a Life Fitness lateral raise, and I like it better than doing with dumbbells and stuff. And so I would do that one, and I had just doing 1 drop set of that twice per week, I had a huge improvement. I think, it was I think my first week, I think my first initial set was 50 pounds, and I dropped to, I think, 40, 30, and 25. And then after 2.5, 3 months, I was up to 75 pounds, dropping to 60, 50, 40. I mean, it was which is a huge improvement for a small muscle group like deltoids. I mean, so I was kind of amazed that I had that type of improvement. But yeah, so I would say drop sets are definitely an effective alternative for people that lack, training time. So.
And then another one I was reading, I think quite recently, for hypertrophy would be looking at doing a pyramid set. Is that something you'd agree with doing as well? I think it was, off the top of my head, it was a descending one, I think it was.
Yeah, so you're talking about, there was one study recently published where they compared traditional sets to pyramid sets to actually drop sets, but it was on legs. And what they found is that as long as you control for the load volume, there wasn't any difference between the methods. So really, what it means is it comes down to a personal preference. I mean, there's no distinct advantage to any of those if you're already training with a reasonably high volume and you're controlling for the load volume. So so whether I do 5 straight sets or 5, pyramid style sets, as long as the overall load volume is similar between the 2 strategies, the gains are going to be similar. So it comes down to personal preference really for that style.
Okay, and our personal preference. Obviously, you're quite well known within the industry for both your hypertrophy and fat loss work. In terms of your personal preference, what further research would you like to obviously see be done?
I want to see more work on volume. When Brad and I did our meta-analysis on the number of sets and weekly set volume and hypertrophy, we're really surprised at the small number of studies really looking at dose response for volume in trained subjects. I mean, there was only 2 or 3 studies. I think there was only 2 looking at a dose response in trained subjects, and so there needs to be more work like that. There needs to be a study where you've got a low volume group, a medium volume group, and a high volume group, and they're all trained subjects, and and then you track them, for 10, 12, 16 weeks or whatever. So yeah, they're definitely that's one area where I would like to see more work on is training volume, because it surprises me that there hasn't been more work done in that area, because there's so many studies out there that just compare 1 to 3 sets, and that's all they do, and like that type of work has been done to death, and so we need more dose response type stuff. What about 1 versus 3 versus 5 sets, or per session, or a weekly volume of 5 sets versus 10 versus 20 or something like that. We definitely need more work like that. So.
And then, if you had to take an initial hypothesis of where you'd see more results coming from, what would be your inkling? Would it be would it be a low, medium, or high?
I would say you'd get more results for the high volume up to a point, but I think I speculate based on some of the studies that I have seen, there doesn't seem to be much of a benefit of going beyond 15 to 20 weekly sets for any particular muscle group. It seems like that's where the gains just totally taper off. But I would say there hasn't been really any good direct work looking at that. So I'm making an inference from studies, other studies that have kind of used those volumes, but haven't really directly investigated a dose response effect. So, there's that one German volume training, for example, that study that was recently published. And, if you looked at the weekly set volume, the one group was like in the mid 15s, I think, per week. I can't remember, maybe 15 to 17 or 15 to 18 sets per week. And then the German volume group was something like, it was twice as big. It was 30 to 36 or something like that. And that German volume group didn't do any better than the group that did half the volume. So that's, that study right there is a hint to me that there is a limit to how much benefit you can get from additional volume. And that limit may be in that, 15 to 20 range possibly, but we need more direct work on that. So.
And if we looked at possibly going over 15, a weekly volume of 15, are you looking at more going towards overtraining? Obviously, the impact that has, obviously, resulting in fatigue, and obviously you're going to kind of regress to a certain extent.
Yeah, to a point. I mean, I think at first you'd rather just kind of, you'll still get gains, but they're not going to be any better. But I think if continued for a long period of time, then yeah, you may start to show some signs of regression or overtraining or things like that. I think it's really hard to really overtrain with weights from a muscular performance perspective. I mean, you got to train a lot, I think, and with a lot of fatigue, and be training to failure all the time and things like that. I think what you got to more watch out for is the impact on like soft tissues and joints and things like that. I think that's where high volumes can really get you. Rather than from a gains perspective, you got to be wary from just an injury overuse type perspective, things like that. So I think that's where people want to be really careful with the really high volumes of training, and if you're going to do a really high volume, make sure you periodize your training at least enough where you got periods of low volume to make sure your joints and stuff don't take a beating. So.
Does it come back to that notion, James, that obviously with people wanting to do high loads of repetitions, they're just concentrating on the repetitions and forgetting about form?
Yeah, you don't want to. Well, there's two things. Yeah, you don't want to forget about your form. You don't want to get reps, whatever the cost. And not even just form, but no matter how good your form is, tissues can only take so much loading, over periods of time, and they need periods of recovery just like anything else. And so, and the thing is soft tissues like ligaments, tendons, things like that, they recover much more slowly than muscle tissue does. and so that's something that people need to be aware of, especially if you're an older trainee. If you're in your late 30s, 40s, 50s, then you really got to be much more careful with the volume. Sometimes you can get away with a lot of things when you're in your 20s, early 30s that you can't necessarily get away with when you're older. So I've learned that the hard way.
And then James, talk to me. What was the reason behind you wanting to go into the how would I put it? The physical competitions.
Oh yeah, so the reason I wanted to do a physique contest was well, a couple things. I mean, I had always been a really naturally skinny guy, so over years I was always trying to bulk up, bulk, but I would never actually try to lean out. And I got away with that for a long period of time, but then over the years, you just keep accumulating a little bit more fat, and then all of a sudden one day you just look down and you're like, geez, I can't believe where I'm at now, And so I decided to do a men's physique show, partly because, I'm not big enough to be a bodybuilder, I didn't have the type of physique to be a bodybuilder, but I do have a nice shoulder to waist taper. Usually when I am really lean, I have a very, very small waist, which I thought, okay, look, that could work well for men's physique, and I'm sure I could do I could never compete in a really big show, but I thought, I could probably do decently in a smaller show, and I knew we had some small local shows, so I thought it'd be a great motivation for me to just establish myself to actually get as lean as possible, because I really hadn't really tried that for a long period of time. So that's what kind of led to that decision, and I ended up placing second in my class out of like 5 guys, and so I did decently, and I'm possibly considering doing another show end of September, early October. I'm not sure yet, though. I haven't really decided whether I want to or not. So it depends on if I feel like I can come back, looking better than I did the last time. So we'll see.
But it's kind of for you. It's kind of showing the scientific knowledge that you have and putting it into how would I put it into a kind of physical state. So you can say, well, this is what I've learned. I put it into practical sense.
Yeah, and I did do that, and actually, for the members of my research review, I've had an ongoing series where I kind of described my prep journey and how I made the decisions I made, and the science that all my decisions was based off of, for whether it was training decisions or diet decisions, things like that. And then also it helps me now, now that I did that, I feel like it helps me with my current clients too. I think it's a lot better, if you're going to coach people, if you've been through something similar, so you can at least identify with them, somewhat. And it also helps my clients too, so they can see me like, hey, he doesn't just have the knowledge, but he knows how to apply it to himself as well. So.
I think that's probably a good notion with any coach. It's you kind of not telling somebody, "I'll do this," but I don't know what the effects are going to be.
Yeah.
And then would be kind of the notion for, I think, from the female perspective, why do you think that women shy away from? It's probably a little bit less so now. With it being obviously commonplace to a certain extent, with people being afraid of the resistance training to a certain extent, because obviously women think they're gonna bulk up.
Yeah.
And obviously from a scientific perspective, what would be kind of the levels of testosterone they would have to take to obviously get like a male from a anabolic kind of standpoint?
Well, yeah, they would have to take. Yeah, I mean, men just naturally have about 10 times the amount of testosterone that women do, and so yeah. I mean, for a woman to gain the type of muscle that a man can, and and I'm going to say on average here. I mean, you're always going to have some genetic freaks out there. There's some women out there that put on muscle really easily, you know, and there are men out there that really struggle to put on muscle. So obviously there's some variation out there, but on average, you know, a man is going to gain a lot more muscle than a woman, you know, if they're training the same so yeah, a woman would have to take, you know, I don't know what type of doses they'd have to take. You know, I'm not very well versed on the actual doses of various steroids and stuff like that. You know, I know certain forms of testosterone. You know, there's research out there looking at doses of like 600 milligrams and things like that. So, you know, I don't know what the doses would be for females, but I just know that, you know, men have 10 times the testosterone that women do, and there's just, you know, the vast majority of women just aren't going to put on the type of muscle that a man can put on. It's just, you know, it just isn't going to happen. So, so there's no reason that women can't, you know, push it hard in the gym and push heavy weights and things like that. It's, you know, it's actually going to be of benefit to them.
And James, why is there that notion that you can apply the hypertrophy kind of methods to both men and women?
Because, you know, even though men and women have different, you know, maybe are different in terms hormonally, and there's some other differences, the way their muscles respond to training is similar in the sense that, you know, you take the muscle tissue of a woman, you probably apply overload to it. You're gonna stimulate protein synthesis in the muscle just like you would with a man, and so you're gonna get an increase in muscle size. There's no reason why the training program needs to be designed, you know, radically different. Now, you know, there are structural differences between men and women that you know, may affect program design a little bit as far as exercise selection and things like that. But overall, you know, you don't necessarily need to design a hypertrophy program for men that much different from the way you would a woman, you know, other than maybe their personal preferences on what they want to see hypertrophy, you know, then you might, you know, obviously change some of your exercise selection and things like that. But, you know, the goal is ultimately, you know, if you're going to go to the gym, whether you're a man or a woman, you're trying to get stronger and you're trying to get bigger, and you know, there's a variety of ways you can do that, and really it comes down to a personal preference and you know, what are you most interested in? Are you most interested in strength, or are you most interested in hypertrophy, or are you interested in kind of a mix of both? You know, so obviously the individual need to be factored in, but overall, you know, if a woman wants to put on muscle, I mean, there's not going to be enormous differences in program design from how a man might put on muscle, you know. So
that's quite interesting, the analogy that you put. Obviously, the only factor is going to be very individualistic, and that's an element of training that you should do anyway.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, obviously, when we come back to that hypertrophy again, obviously it's something that even if you wanted to lose weight, is something you want to obviously look at training as well.
Yeah. So, and I, because that's the thing. I mean, you know, even if you're just someone interested in weight loss, you want to try to preserve your muscle tissue as best as you can, and the best way to preserve muscle is basically train to build it. You know, now if you're in energy deficit, you're most of the time you're not going to build as much as you would if you're not, but still you're going to have the same effect. And so, you know, I am of the opinion that the best program for maintaining muscle in an energy deficit is not going to be that much different from the best program for building muscle when you're not in an energy deficit. So.
And James, if you're doing too much cardio, can that have an effect, obviously, on your muscle density?
Well, there is, you know, a lot of data out there on what I would call interference between endurance training and strength training, and there is evidence that if you do too much cardio, you may impair your gains in hypertrophy. Now, there's going to be a lot of genetic differences in terms of that. I mean, I've seen some guys. I mean, you look at a guy like Alex Viada. I mean, that guy is amazing. He does a lot of endurance training, but he's also put on some pretty amazing muscle too. So, so there are ways you can combine the two, but for the most part, I would say, you know, if you're interested in putting on as much muscle as possible, you know, too much endurance training is probably gonna interfere with that process. So, you know, it comes down to specificity. You know, it's you know, specific adaptation to imposed demands. You know, it's like, you know, what exactly are you trying to achieve? And if you put too much, you know, if you're sending your body mixed signals, you know, one area you're trying to tell it to gain muscle and get bigger, and the other area you're trying to, like, well, no, we want to gain all this endurance and possibly even get smaller in the process. You know, you're sending two different signals. So.
And what would constitute too much cardio, or would it depend on the individual?
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the individual, because it's going to depend. I mean, it's going to depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on their training volume, in terms of the weights. It's going to depend on what their diet is like. I mean, obviously, the more they're dieting, you know, if you're in a bigger energy deficit, you're not going to be able to handle as much. And then there's just going to be genetic differences. You know, someone who really struggles to put on muscle, probably shouldn't be doing any endurance training, versus someone who has a really easy time putting on muscle, probably can get away with a fair amount of endurance training. So I'd say, yeah, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule to that. It's really going to depend on the person. So.
Well, that's some very useful tips there, James. So I think we'll wrap it up there. So once again, thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And for everybody else, this podcast will be aired every Thursday. So until next week, I will see you then.